Well, I'm certainly not late to the discussing of this franchise. So, this video is probably going to end up being quite long, like the Stargate video from a couple of months ago, and hence why this says part 1 at the front. With part 2, that is still going to be another 4 weeks ahead. We're not just going to have 2 consecutive in a row. Just to clarify that point, and I'll go into the specifics of how it's being split up, why it's being split up, more specifically, other than the fact it's just a long video, as we go forwards. But as I say, for now, and in between these 2 videos, we'll be going back to our regular Ragnarok Chronicles content, which, hello, welcome to the channel. My name is Dominic, and welcome to the first Non-Chronicles video of the year, which isn't that surprising, considering it's only the second video of the year at all. Yeah, that didn't work out quite that way, did it? Oh well, here we are for our second attempt at this video, and I don't want to waste too much time reiterating what I've already said in previous ones to explain the whole switch up. So let's just say I'm going to be making sure that the computer isn't just losing 3/5 of the footage this time and get straight into it. As I said at the end of the Saw sequel video back at the end of last year, I acknowledge that the topic of this video, again, isn't necessarily going to be something that everyone will have watched or have wanted to watch. This, in this case, from the thumbnail and the title and what I've said previously, being Game of Thrones. Hopefully that works for getting the music in. I mean, even if it doesn't, A, I don't get these videos monetized anyway, and B, I can use the editing feature on YouTube to remove that clip. And this explanation as well. Either way though, yes, Game of Thrones. So, be it for, well, any number of reasons within the show itself, I can totally understand people not wanting to watch it, not really, it not being their thing, but also hopefully just want to say at this juncture, if you've seen any of these making a sequel videos before, or like whatever preconceived notions you may have about the show, we're not going to be doing anything that could in any way hopefully be construed as gratuitous. I mean, there'll be the notion of death and stuff, but nothing like, what's actually in the show itself. So hopefully people are all right with that. And those who have watched the show, hopefully, shouldn't need any kind of disclaimer anyway. In regards to my own personal experience with the show, when it started, I definitely was too young to be watching it. Not that that stopped certain other members of my school year group, and they made it clear why they were watching it and enjoying it. But anyway, I was too young for it, and also I just didn't see that I would ever watch it. It seemed to be something I'd be interested in. Therefore, I at no point made an effort to avoid spoilers. Therefore, and I can't remember exactly what year it was, but you can work it out, it was the summer before the 8th series aired, I decided at that point, I'm looking for something to watch, I might as well give it a go now. So I watched series 1 through 7, all in one go, granted over however many weeks. And yeah, by that point, because I hadn't been avoiding spoilers, I knew what a lot of the major beats and twists and turns were going to be. But even so, I found it enjoyable, certainly. After which I then joined the rest in waiting for the final series to air. And it's in that final series that we actually now should probably come to talking about why this is making a sequel video. This isn't going to be talking about what I think should happen after the 8th series, or even what should happen in the prequel shows that are being made. Thirdly, this is not a retrospective what I think the 8th season should have been. Although, in saying that, this is where I'm now going to be getting very particular. For I still argue that this majority is going to be a sequel, in that I came up with this idea between the release of episode 3 and episode 4 of that series. Just for my general view of series 8, I've always stood by the fact that given that they chose to limit themselves to 6 episodes, they did more or less well, right? It did what it needed to do in those 6 episodes. That being said, had they given themselves more episodes, then it definitely would have been better, because they wouldn't have been rushing to get everything done. An example of the rushing being the long night. This notion of the coming White Walkers and the Whites that have been coming since the very first scene in the very first episode called Winter is Coming, it just then gets dealt with in a single episode, the long night. And at the time, I was just feeling like, well, what if they had given themselves more episodes? What if we had had a whole series of the long night to really pay off this thing that they had been building towards? So, yes, is it an alternate timeline? I guess, also because, again, as we'll see, I do kind of retroactively, I add in a couple of bits in what would have been the first couple of episodes to set up other stuff that I would have done. But still, I prefer to think this was still how the series could have gone on from that point, rather than looking backwards, what I should have done differently. Again, me being very picky on that, as I've said. There is one element that I did actually go back and change in retrospect, because in the final episode of the series there was one moment. It hadn't even occurred to me that sort of thing would happen, but I really liked the moment. I thought it worked well. So I did at that point open the document back up and add that in, but I will say what that element is when we get to part 2 of this whole thing and we talk about the final episode. But other than that, that was the only thing. There are other kind of character arcs and elements that ended up being similar to what then happened in episodes 4, 5 and 6, or especially episode 6 of the real show, just because it kind of, with how things have been set up, it kind of made sense that the characters would go that way. So there are similarities in that respect. But again, everything I'm basically about to read to you here was me proposing what could have happened rather than saying, well, actually, I would have done this episode differently this way after the fact. I've been circling at these kind of points for probably too long, just to make sure everything's clear. We should really be moving on to the content itself. One final thing that I will just note before we get really into it is, again, this distinction of parts 1 and part 2 of this video, because again, otherwise this would end up probably even longer than the Stargate one, which is already a few hours. In terms of, having more space within which to tell the story properly, at the time, my thought was, okay, what if, rather than reducing themselves to 6 episodes, they had stuck to the traditional 10 episodes? So this whole plan that I have here would have been 10 episodes long. But even then, again, at some point later, like a year or whatever afterwards, when my mind happened to come back to this concept, it occurred to me that even then, I was probably cramming a bit much into each concept for an episode. And therefore, what I might actually have preferred to have done is turn it into 12 episodes. So take a couple of them and stretch them out. Again, once we get there, I'll clarify which ones I would have changed in which way. And instead of having one series of 12, we would then have 2 seasons of 6, like how the real season 8 was 6 episodes. So what we'll now do is, let's say in the document that's here, but there's also going to be a Google Drive link down below so that you can read it yourself if you want, like I did for the Mario video. Yeah, in this document, it's still split up as in, well, it will be 10 episodes in total. What I've done is said, okay, first 5 episodes will be in this first document that you've already got linked, and then episodes 6 through 10 will be in a separate document linked in the second one, so halves this way. And then, even though it's still written as 5 episodes on the document, when we get to the point where I'd split it up, I'll clarify how actually I would have turned this into 6 episodes, story-wise. But anyway, without any further ado, for the first episode of the series, this is mostly going to be staying the same. As I say, to begin with, the only change that I'll be making to the prior episodes, because I'm more looking at what would have happened afterwards, I'm just going to add in a couple of scenes so that things that would occur in later episodes are being set up enough in advance. As such, the episode Winterfell, which otherwise, you have your forces in the north gathering to defend against the armies of winter that are coming south from the wall. So you have Jon joining up with Daenerys and all their forces there. Meanwhile, in the south, you have Cersei, who is preparing to attack whoever it is that wins in the north. She's assuming, the human sides, but she's preparing there, and as part of that, she sent off Euron over to Essos to get the Golden Company, who are these specialised soldiers who are meant to be the best that money can buy. As such, as the opening scene of this episode, I would now actually make that seeing Euron getting the Golden Company. Not because we need to see that explicitly, because in the real episode we kind of just cut to him sailing back, I believe, and he already has them, but rather so that we can also see that while he is in Essos, he actually also gets in trouble, because while there, he kills and eats an old man of the river, that being a specific breed of giant turtle that's present in the books. There will be a couple of things throughout this where I have sourced from the books as well, and I'll again highlight those when we get to them rather than just solely from the show. Anyway, he kills this turtle because he's exploring a different part of the world, he's going to enjoy the delicacies, and yeah, he gets in trouble with the people in the area for having done that. To accommodate for this new scene at the beginning, the remainder of the scenes set around King's Landing later in the episode would probably be shifted slightly further back to give a more conceivable notion of time having passed between this first scene and the other ones. Now already, because this would be the very opening scene, maybe even before the credits, it's more ambiguous as to how much earlier that scene may have actually taken place. So in this instance, we may not have to worry so much about, consistency of how much time is passing. But as we go into later episodes, there will be places where people are travelling from place to place over a larger distance. In the real show, especially in the later series, there were some people who were complaining that characters seemingly were fast travelling. Whereas earlier in the show, it would take people time to get from one place to another, people were now just dotting about the map. In certain cases here, in order to keep the story going, I am, as I say, having people kind of maybe start in one place in the episode and they set off, then later in the episode they then arrive at this next place further away. Well, the way I should be okay with this is in those instances, everyone kind of time skips. It's not like we see one story thread is happening within the space of an hour or whatever, and there's this other story thread that we're jumping backwards and forwards to is actually taking place over however many days or weeks. Now, if we time jump to get people just to the other end of the next leg of the journey, every story thread is then around that time also seeing a progression in some way. But anyway, yeah, just to help things along, shifts King's Landing scenes as best as can be fit slightly later into the episode, respectively. Then, to the end of that first episode, when we get to that final moment where Jaime arrives at Winterfell and he sees Bran and they have their stare-off because this is the first time they've met since he pushed Bran off tower. Just before we get to that point, we would also see in that same kind of courtyard somebody attaching a small item wrapped in cloth to a messenger raven and sending that raven off into the sky. And then again, as the camera's panning around, as we're seeing that, and then see Jaime and whatever, we would note that that person who sent off the raven had been standing next to Bran as well. That's all that we need to set up there. The rest can stay the same. Moving now on to episode 2, A Night of the Seven Kingdoms. Again, for the most part, this will all stay the same, just adding in a couple of bits. In King's Landing, Cersei assigns Qyburn with a task that he doesn't seem entirely happy with, yet we as the audience aren't privy to what it is just yet. And meanwhile, he's told he should leave his other work to the rest of the alchemists, who are still at this time being led by Halline. I will just say, in certain cases, I don't know how to pronounce some of these words necessarily, either because it's been a long time since I saw the character on the show, or they weren't in the show and this is more I found their name on a wiki and whatever. Let's call it Halline, Horline, whatever. Leave it to them, while again Qyburn does this new job for Cersei. She also mentions that the usurper, i.e. Daenerys, she'll burn, Cersei will make sure the usurper burns, to which Qyburn points out that, well, as a Targaryen, she is immune to fire, at which Cersei, is adamant, no, she will nevertheless find a way to make sure that fire is her downfall. After she leaves, Halline comments to Qyburn that he too has had to leave behind his own projects as Cersei reassigns them all, but Qyburn scoffs at that, saying that Halline wasn't having any progress with her anyway. Once again, the her here not being explained to the audience, just as yet it's left mysterious. Elsewhere in the city, a member of the Golden Company comes across Angai, who is one of the last known, named surviving members of the Brotherhood Without Banners, and who Angai is seemingly, studying the Red Keep from a distance, although Angai just brushes this off as the curiosity of someone who is new to the city, taking in the landmarks. Indeed, though, there may just be some valid reason for the curiosity, as even from this distance, it can be seen that loads of supplies are being brought into the Red Keep. Supplies that, from the looks of it, will be used to make reinforcements and renovations of some kind. Then, for the final other amendment, out in Essos, so wherever it would fit in the episode, at the ruins of Goyen Dro, we see Kinvara, who is one of the known Red Priestesses, meeting up with Quaithe, who was the mysterious masked figure that Daenerys met in Season 2 and then just never came up again. Anyway, these two individuals are meeting there at the ruins per a prearranged agreement. It's all but stated that each of them have other people kind of waiting somewhere nearby, and if necessary, as well as there also being carts and carriages with some sorts of supplies, as desired. Once more, because we're being mysterious, the precise nature of their meeting isn't made explicit. However, as they're coming to settle the deal, each one gets the impression that they're getting the upper hand on the other. All we really definitely get, though, is a sense that there are preparations that each of them is going to do something for the other at a certain time, making sure that he and she, respectively, are set off in the right directions. Once the interaction is done, Kinvara mentions that she'll be next heading off towards Qohor. Before leaving, however, she does ponder why Quaithe picked this place, and the Shadowbinder indirectly mentions that this city was destroyed at the hands of the dragons of Valyria. And once again, that's all we'll need to add for episode 2. So in the first 2 cases, just a couple of scenes setting up things a little bit mysterious. Now, though, is where we start to get into much more major changes. Nevertheless, the start of episode 3, The Long Night, would remain the same. However, as we get through the battle, first of all, we'll notice that as Bran is using his green sight, so projecting his mind into other places and indeed potentially through time, it appears as though he has been perturbed by something that he's seen. He proceeds to focus on looking back to something that we're not privy to, and when asked at another point by Theon what it is that he's seeing, he responds with something which suggests the future. Some of the actual White Walkers, rather than the undead Whites, actually also enter the Castle of Winterfell at this point in this version of the story, and still though they're mainly watching the undead swarm over the living, but also we see at least one show their own power in a clash with a named character. I've suggested here probably Pod, because I didn't really have anything else for him to do in the story, and dark to say that he's a character that people seem to care about, and also it was set up in the previous episode, the actual episode 2, that Brienne and Jaime were already wondering whether he was actually ready for something like this. So yes, we'll have the White Walker show prowess by striking down Pod. Speaking of Brienne and Jaime, though, despite all that Jaime has done to get used to having a false hand for however many last previous series is, now we really get to see, though, that for all his training, for all his getting used to it, he still is never going to be the swordsman that he once was. And as such, he's almost put into a position where he's overcome by the dead and is only saved by Brienne coming in and properly helping him fend them off. He thus leaves this encounter with kind of a shattered sense of his own self and his own battle worth, but at the same time with a even stronger bond to Brienne. Beric, meanwhile, is brought back by the Lord of Light one final time, this witnessed by Melisandre, giving her hope that indeed her lord hasn't abandoned them after all. This boost also being what then fuels her interaction with Arya, as she, describes her as being like essentially the chosen one, more or less, as happens in the actual episode. When Melisandre does then actually interact with Beric again, however, it is noted that because he loses a bit of himself each time he's brought back to life, there's probably so little of him left at this point that it wouldn't work again. That was the last time that he could be brought back and still be him. Nevertheless, in the face of this, Beric still opts to go down towards the crypts to protect the likes of Sansa and Tyrion and the others that are all hiding down there. The Hound refuses to go with him still, though, as again I believe happened in the actual episode. And in doing so, Beric then does die for that final time while, again, defending the people in the crypts. Outside, when the wounded Viserion starts attacking the courtyard, we this time actually also see Rhaegal returning to fight the former again, to fight the brother, yeah, that's what they are, and the clashing pair thus cause major damage to the castle, which actually ends up exposing an alternative route out of the crypts and to the surface, through which those inside can now escape. As such, this is then where Sansa would lead those people out, some of them still falling foul to the crumbling rubble, because again there's major structural damage to that part of the castle, and as all these people are fleeing, you have some people who were on the battlefield, like Sam, Brienne, Jaime. They notice this and they, come to help defend them. Sam especially then trying to make sure he can find Gilly and Little Sam within the group of escapees. Not all of the named fighters in the battlefield are doing this, however. Elsewhere, Grey Worm and the remainder of the Unsullied are finding themselves surrounded by the undead, and with more and more people falling around them and the bodies piling up, all it needs is then for one of the White Walkers to use their powers to raise all of those piles of undead, so that now Grey Worm, etc., are in an even worse position, are surrounded even more thickly by the undead. Seems like there's no way out for them, although they'll still try to go out fighting valiantly. That is until, out of the shadows, Arya comes leaping, performing the manoeuvre that she actually does on the Night King in the real episode to kill that particular White Walker. Thus, we still get her showing off that manoeuvre, and it also works to save those named characters there that were being surrounded, because once you kill the White Walker that's risen the dead, those particular members of the dead fall back down again. However, she is not doing this to end the fight overall this time. Instead, now that Viserion has been kind of moved elsewhere by Rhaegal, Jon is no longer delayed in running to the Godswood. He hence arriving there just after the Night King killed Theon, again in the same manner that he did in the real show. Not one to rush getting the Three-Eyed Raven killed over with, and recognising Jon from Hardhome, the Night King then has his generals part ways to the side to allow Jon through so that they can face each other. The Night King should definitely be the one to bring Jon down. During this distraction between the Night King and Jon, Bran has now found what knowledge he was seeking for using his green sight, and now he intends to kind of project himself into Sam to pass that information on. With all of the chaos that's going on, however, he actually instead ends up walking into Gilly, thus implanting all the information in her, and she becomes overwhelmed with this knowledge. With all this taking place, though, Jon can't really hold up against the Night King. Unless a miracle happens, he is not going to be the one winning this fight. That being said, it seems just for one moment that a miracle is about to happen, that maybe he can actually find this small opportunity, at which point the Night King grips him and turns him into a White Walker. The shot actually detailing Jon's transformation into this icy creature being slow and really portraying the pain of the transformation. This was when Arya then arrived at the Godswood, again having been delayed in saving Grey Worm, etc. And she is only able to watch on in horror as her brother is lost. When it's over, the Night King senses her presence, but she's not as much of a specific threat that Jon was, so there's no need to go through the same. He makes sure he dispatches her. Instead, though, what he does, rather than getting his generals to take her down, while she's still watching, he puts down his own spear and instead takes Longclaw, the sword from the White Walker Jon. Bran is then just able to say, "I'm sorry, Jon," before stopping walking, reverting back to his regular self, at which point the Night King, with Longclaw, beheads him, in a parallel for Arya having to see her father being beheaded all the way back in season 1 from a distance, unable to do anything to stop it. This time, though, Arya is determined that she won't run away. She's about to charge forward to strike at Night King. She's just lost 2 of her brothers in moments next to each other. However, just as she's about to charge, Drogon swoops over and sets the Goldwood ablaze. Still, Arya wants to advance, but then for a second obstacle for her doing so, the Hound then finally catches up with her. That's the reason why he hadn't gone with Beric. He was trying to keep tabs on what Arya was doing. He comes here and basically drags her away, saying it's over, probably swearing a lot in the process, and also this being a second show with the first one already happening kind of in the episode that already as it exists, but a second show of him overcoming his fear of fire as he pulls her back through the burning trees. Overall, retreat is the only real good move left to the forces that are gathered at Winterfell, and therefore those soldiers are trying to join with the people who are fleeing the crypts to overall, again, leave south out of the fortress. Ghost, the dire wolf, also seen here to be kind of going around and defending people just to confirm that he is still around as well. As a final gambit, Melisandre uses her magic to influence all the dragonglass around, and be it in the form of weapons that have fallen on the battlefield, or items and tools that people are still holding, or even just in like the raw dragonglass that Gendry didn't get around to forging into any shape. And she influences all this dragonglass, turns it all into kind of particulates in the breeze, it all kind of comes apart, and then forms this cloud, which kind of acts as a barrier against all of the dead, because again, the weakness of theirs is dragonglass. In this kind of particulate cloud form, it's not concentrated enough to kill any of them or the White Walkers, but it is nevertheless kind of holding them back, giving the people of Winterfell more time to escape in. I will just say at this juncture that this story over all of these two series is technically, especially in the second half, I do end up leaning in more on the magic side of things. I try to keep it to magic that is at least already in some way set up as a possibility within the books, if not the show. But yes, that is one thing. Regardless, throughout all of this, as ever with these making a sequel videos, I am not proposing these as perfect. I'm sure there will be flaws. But just in this version I have come up with, yes, I will acknowledge I do maybe lean in more on the magic at the ending than the actual show may have, or indeed did. But still, just with that note aside, we saw a couple more points left for episode 3. You have Ser Jorah, who we haven't seen in any of my additional or amended scenes, is still trying to defend Daenerys as best he can, but ultimately he falls fighting for her, as again happens in the real episode. She wants to cry and mourn for him, but the dead are still coming, there isn't time for this. So she picks up his sword and tries to again, fend them off as best she can, also trying to drag Jorah's body with her, but ultimately it's just very clear that she can't get out and bring him with her, so she's forced to abandon him where he is and again try to make her own way out. Indeed, by this time, the dead and the enemy in general are being held back slightly by the dragonglass cloud that was created by Melisandre, so Daenerys does also have that on her side, but it's not until Tormund comes by and helps her that she properly is able to flee the immediate danger and join up with everyone else who's getting out of there. With Drogon and Rhaegal now swooping at the back of the retreating group to use their fire to fend off any other whites that are potentially still getting near despite the dragonglass cloud, everyone else is now moving south as quickly as they can, leaving Winterfell in smoke and ruins. The silhouette of Viserion behind the dragonglass cloud, just able to be seen moving around there still. For the final moments, we cut back to the Godswood, where the Night King passes Longclaw over to one of his other generals, who proceeds to plunge it into the face of the now burning main tree. The White Walkers thus then move away, summoning the other dead to rally back around them over there, victorious in the death of the Three-Eyed Raven, as had been kind of their main priority in attacking Winterfell in the first place. And then just as it's all happening, the final shot lingers on the White Walker, Jon Snow. From here on in then, this is where the entirety of the episodes become completely divergent from what happened in the real show, although, to be clear, the title for episode 4 I have also used Last of the Starks for, because again, when episode 3 aired, you had those trailers for the next episodes immediately afterwards, and we knew that that's what the title for episode 4 was going to be. So again, I thought, okay, that's what, at the time, before it aired, I knew that was going to be episode 4's title, so I kept it anyway. But also, with what happens in this plot here, it fits for, what is covered in this plot. I think I'm going to stay at this juncture, that this is actually where then we would start to have like splitting up of episodes as I've defined them into slightly more. So whereas here we have episode 4 and episode 5, what I'll probably do is take all the events that are delegated to these 2 episodes and then redistribute them slightly such that they would take place over 3 episodes. What this does is it means that there's not so much crammed into just these 2, there's slightly less pressure on them, and also that then allows for, as well as the development of those scenes, an easier way to get the impression that time is passing. That as the characters move from place to place, there is still, gaps between that. They aren't just teleporting from here to here to here very quickly. To open this version of Last of the Starks, though, as it is defined in the document, if you are reading along with that as well, which you start in King's Landing, where news of the fall of Winterfell has reached Cersei. She knows now that the dead actually won after all, and are now continuing their way south, and eventually, given enough time, they will have made it so far down the continent, they would surely reach King's Landing as well. News of what the Night King's actual intentions are, that being wiping out any trace of the memory of humanity, has also made it down there. So the characters in King's Landing also know that that's what kind of the key to all of this is. Still sticking to her convictions, however, she doesn't waver from her former orders that they should be preparing their forces down in the south. Again, she had been predicting that they would instead be fighting off the forces of the north eventually. Harry Strickland, who is the head of the Golden Company, and would have other members named elsewhere in these episodes as we get to interact with a bit more, but I'm not going to be here making up names for them. We'll just say other members of the Golden Company if necessary. But Harry Strickland, on hearing the news of the dead winning in the north, he wants to learn more about this because he and the Golden Company were brought here by Euron under the understanding that they would be fighting the likes of Jon Snow's armies and Daenerys' armies. So this is something different than what they had been informed of upon accepting payment. As such, Harry makes to summon a maester from Old Town to bring all that they know about the White Walkers. Yet when he tries to, he learns that such a summons had already been made by Cersei herself. For while she won't admit that it's an anxiety of hers, it is, acknowledged that we have the White Walkers and the Night King going to be on their doorstep. So yes, she does also secretly want to make sure that they have more on their side than just physical military force. Meanwhile, Jaqen H'ghar reveals himself to have in fact been the one disguised as the member of the Golden Company, who is seen in episode 2, A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, interacting with Anguy, noting him spying the Red Keep. And it turns out that Jaqen was hired in Essos to assassinate Euron as retribution for him having kind of killed the sacred animal that was the Old Man of the River. And so he disguised himself as a member of the Golden Company, followed them all the way back here, looking for an opportunity to dispatch Euron. Before he gets the chance to enact his orders, however, although he gets close, he then suddenly notices that there's a shadow entity, like the shadow baby that killed Renly in Season 2, so it appears and seems to start pursuing him. Thus what we have is Jaqen and Euron running through the city, trying to escape from the shadow entity. Jaqen making sure not to lose sight of Euron as they go, for that man has now realised that he was about to be assassinated, so would make sense that he wants to get away from his would-be killer in the process. And the sequence ends when they get to where the Great Sept is now being rebuilt. So you've got that whole area where the Sept used to be is still levelled from Season 6. As too do we have kind of the surrounding, like where the houses were. Those two are still relatively levelled. Even though Cersei, I can imagine, doesn't necessarily want the set rebuilt as it was, she acknowledges the people of the city still need somewhere to go to worship. So the pair of them are there, and Jaqen has acknowledged now that changing his face doesn't seem to do anything to dissuade the shadow entity, because he was doing that while they were running and it had no effect. They're just faced there with nothing else seemingly to do, and yet the shadow entity doesn't kill him. Instead, when it touches him, there seems to be some kind of understanding and recognition shared between the two of them before the shadow entity then dissipates. As the pair of them then wonder what just happened, other guards flock in to bring Jaqen to Cersei. Shifting back up to the north, we see all the people who managed to escape Winterfell now thinking, because they have to flee on foot to get away from the dead, because they're still going to be advancing ultimately. Despite the buffer of the Dragonglass cloud, I think it's going to be easier for them to go on road rather than across country. Therefore, they're all trying to stick to the King's Road as best they can. Behind them can already be seen more of a wintry cloud engulfing the sky and slowly getting bigger and travelling further southwards. So that's kind of a marker and providing a sense of how far winter has fully gotten. Not to say that the undead can't be a bit further ahead than it in turn. And indeed, we would see this cloud getting further and further south across the course of the series, both in terms of the scenes and maybe also in the opening title credits itself. But either way, there then is, as we go through the episodes, less and less of a sense of day and night. It's all just grey winter. Along this journey, Sansa has held on to her position as Lady of the North, and you have other surviving, powerful Northerners like Lady Barbary Dustin, Lord Roderick Ricewell, Lord Mazin, and Maester Wolken. So they're forming a kind of rudimentary small council for her as they go. And also amongst the matters discussed as they travel is whether they should ask the Iron Islands for sanctuary, because the moving water should be something that the dead or the White Walkers at least can't cross. Gilly, meanwhile, elsewhere in the group, is still kind of reeling from the knowledge and kind of everything that Bran accidentally put into her head. So Sam is simultaneously trying to take care of her, but also make sense of everything that she's seeing. In a third part of the group, Melisandre is still convinced that Arya is the champion who will defeat the Night King, as seen in her kind of visions and prophecies, and therefore is still trying to prepare the young woman for that role that she will presumably still fulfill at some point. Arya, in turn, has taken it upon herself to look after Ghost, now that Jon is gone. Davos isn't exactly happy with Melisandre taking so much interest in Arya. He still feels that she hasn't learnt, therefore, from everything that went wrong with Shireen in previous seasons. However, for all of these misgivings that he has, he doesn't actually do, or he might say something, but nothing major happens of his feelings. Nevertheless, another thing he also blames her for is the fact that she got rid of all of their dragon glass, which they would use to defend themselves, even though it was that magical action of hers that even allowed them to escape Winterfell in the first place. He still holds it against her as her having weakened them. With that left as it is then, we then also just have our fourth instance of what's going on in this Exodus group, that seeing Jaime and Brienne. Post-battle, they have time to consider everything that just happened there. And, Jaime reassessing his position as a military individual and how he did in the battle, but also they're able to get to terms with how the two of them stand with each other. All of those branches of conversation aside, though, as they're walking or riding or whatever mode it is that they have, we then will just switch back to King's Landing temporarily, where now Cersei has kind of heard what happened involving Jaqen, and rather than having him executed or anything for trying to kill Euron, instead she believes that she can have him make use of his abilities to her own ends, which Euron can vouch for having seen him change his face and so forth. As it turns out, she wants to use him as best he can to take on Tyenne's face, she being the now deceased daughter of Ilaria, who's still kept down in the dungeons, with the idea that in pretending to be Tyene, he will be able to persuade Ilaria in her kind of delirium to agree to then, she'll come down with them to Dorne to get all of Dorne's armies to come up and join the fight at King's Landing for them. Back in the north, the Exodus has now stopped at Castle Cerwyn, where Lord Clay's remaining forces are able to provide them with some sort of supplies, horses, food, etc., although it's still nowhere near enough, considering how many people are now heading south. And indeed, it's not just the people who left Winterfell, but also as they've been going, they've been trying to warn anyone in any settlements that they've been passing as well. So you've had kind of scout parties sometimes going off to check if there's anyone over there who could also, for the moment at least, be saved from the Night King's wrath. And with that, you could have also had kind of scenes where the likes of Tormund is going on getting people, and then as they're coming back, he, it's just venting his own opinions to them. They can't really do anything about it, especially surrounding the fact that it's unfair that Brienne is now showing interest in Jaime rather than in him. Speaking of people kind of channeling their feelings, while at this pit stop, Daenerys also then speaks with Sam about her opinions on Jon, since Sam was apparently kind of the other person who knew about his true heritage and how he technically had a greater claim to the throne than she did. Because of that claim to the throne and the fact he's now gone, on the one hand, she should be relieved that she is now still the rightful heir to take the Iron Throne, as she's been looking to do for all of these years. That being said, she still also has lost her lover in this instance, so she's conflicted about that. Sam, for his part, he in turn is also kind of conflicted and not entirely happy with Daenerys, because he's still acting upon the revelation that was, again, in the actual show, like episode 2, that she basically had his father and brother killed. In turn, throughout this leg of the journey, Daenerys hasn't been content with Sansa being in charge, still being like the Lady of the North in this case. And while Daenerys won't call her out on anything and make any kind of accusations to try to gain power over the group that way, she does still ask here and there, well, if you've got these kind of people at Castle Kerwin, or the people they've been finding in settlements along the way, if these people were also in the north, why weren't they also at Winterfell to help fight? Why weren't you getting them as well? We might have won with them. And that's kind of her way of openly questioning Sansa's leadership without, again, officially challenging her. That being said, though, because it would be the fastest way to replenish the dragonglass, the function that Daenerys then finds herself assuming is that she will take Drogon and basically fly backwards and forwards as quickly as she can to Dragonstone. Again, we'll gather some more supplies and have Drogon carry them in kind of a special harness thing that Gendry has made for him, so that he can carry more than just what would be in his claws or whatever. So she'll kind of bring them back more dragonglass as best she can. In doing so, she will leave Rhaegal with them, because again, until they have more dragonglass, he's kind of the only other way of really properly defending them. And she kind of leaves him begrudgingly with Tyrion, since Tyrion does have some kind of rapport with the dragons already, even though he can never really control them in that respect. And also, from her point of view, Daenerys kind of rationalises with herself that by there still being a dragon always nearby, people won't forget her presence, and she will still be kind of there will always be a symbol of her being the political power that she is. As a final thing before leaving, she also gives Varys some specific instructions on how he should speak for her in her stead, in order to still get, things going the way she wants, such as making sure it's not forgotten that as they're heading south, they should still make sure to go by King's Landing so that the Iron Throne can be claimed for her. And while Varys does agree in the moment to do this for her, once she's gone and when she's not present, it will actually be seen that he's not really sticking to that. Rather, instead, he speaks supposedly in her name, but more in the ways that he thinks things should go instead. Which he just does feel a little bit guilty about, going behind her back, but still, again, it's about what he thinks should be done. Even further down south in King's Landing, we catch up with what has now been kind of the start of the naval expedition down towards Dawn to gather those armies, and the ships have stopped at Sharp Point, where they're going to rest. Here it's shown that while Ilaria has at first, again, as predicted in her delirium, kind of been overjoyed by having her daughter supposedly with her again, at this point she knows something's wrong, though, and it's kind of the knowledge that Tyene is actually dead is still kind of creeping around the back of her mind too much, and at this point kind of this feeling of being stuck in this position of horror, she tries to throw herself off a cliff onto the rocks below, but before she can, Jaqen, still wearing Tyene's face, manages to hold her back and drag her back and ties her up to make sure that she can't do that again. At Castle Kerwin, it's been concluded that the reason why the dead aren't getting further south even quicker than they are, as might be expected, is because actually they're now taking their time, making sure they're sweeping the entire landscape, getting everyone that they pass, because they can afford to be patient and slow and methodical and thorough in their extermination of humanity. As part of this, word has reached Castle Kerwin that Deepwood Motte, which was the seat of Lord Robert Glover, where he had chosen to stay rather than joining the Battle of Winterfell, again, per the actual episodes, that has now fallen. He and all of his people have now joined the ranks of the dead. When the Exodus thus leaves Castle Kerwin again, it's from this point decided that the Unsullied will start breaking off and staying behind at intervals, wherein they will stand watch for how the dead are progressing, and what they'll do is, if they notice that they're getting close, they'll light a pyre, which will alert the next people along down the countryside, and then they'll hurry to join back up and so forth. So it's kind of like how in Lord of the Rings, where you had the lighting of the fires to alert that Gondor was in need. But yes, except in this way, it's more the dead are here. This is a mark of how far they've got. And again, you get the idea. Even further north, back around Winterfell, we now see the White Walker Jon striding through the throngs of the Whites. And as he goes through, they kind of change from a rabble into more kind of regimented and orderly. However, that's not really the purpose. More instead, it's clear that he's looking for something or some things amidst their ranks. For the Exodus, their next thought is that they might be able to get some help from the Eyrie with what forces remained there to keep that guarded. Those who didn't join the Battle of Winterfell, as some of them did. So we're thinking they might be able to get help from the Eyrie. Jon Royce, Tyrion and Davos kind of prepare to split off and head that way, planning to go via White Harbour and then sailing across the sea around to the Vale, rather than still going by land along the King's Road, as everyone else is still going to be doing. In regards to Rhaegal, because he was technically left in Tyrion's charge, kind of acknowledged, for all that Tyrion may have a rapport with the dragons, he still can't control them. So from his point of view, he doesn't see that there's any difference in him being there or not. So Rhaegal still staying kind of with the rest of the humans, and protecting them and otherwise feeding off livestock as he needs to. Tyrion will leave. At the notion of this, Sam also believes that part of what Gilly might have been talking about in regards to what she's seen might have had something to do with kind of the East. He asks that they get to join them. And in turn, Melisandre also seemingly has had some sort of vision of light from the East, which is seen whilst gazing into the fire, as per her way of trying to interpret the Lord of Light. And so, as a final addition to that group heading that way, you also now have Melisandre, who's also bringing along Arya and Ghost. There are objections from certain parties about splitting up in this way, but ultimately it's agreed that this is what they'll do. We therefore just have some conversation between, first of all, Sansa and Arya, and it's acknowledged that they are the last of the Starks, hence why the episode title is still apt, should they really be splitting up. And then also we get to see a conversation between Jaime and Tyrion, as theoretically this may be the last time they see each other, being able to say what they need to as brothers. And I believe a version of that conversation did actually happen, maybe episode 5, something like that in the real show, but anyway, something of that ilk at this parting of the ways. Now, maybe possible content warning for this next bit if you are uncomfortable with notions that are kind of related to self-harm, I guess. So if you are, then just skip ahead to whatever timestamp I put at the bottom here. Anyway, now at sharp point, as the ship is about to sail off again, to continue going towards dawn, it's discovered that despite being restrained, Ilaria has still managed to end her suffering in that she has managed to find a way to slit her wrists. At least Yakin is still able to use her face rather than Tyene, so it kind of cuts out the middleman. So now he assumes the form of Ilaria, and as they carry on their way towards dawn. And meanwhile, a message is sent back towards King's Landing to update Cersei that when they see each other again, he'll be wearing this new face instead. At King's Landing, Ebros from Old Town has now arrived, and he's brought with him the scrolls that they have on the White Walkers, per the summons from King's Landing, even though he still, as per his last appearance in the actual show, even though he still doesn't believe that they're really a thing. After learning certain details about the White Walkers from these scrolls, Cersei thus sends Euron north towards Ramsgate via Dragonstone in order to capture a White for a strategy of her own. It takes some convincing to get him to agree to do it, because he still very much doesn't want to see a White again after the display in the Dragon Pit in Series 7, but she then uses the potential pregnancy of hers that's still going on with was meant to be his baby so far as she's telling him, to convince him to get on with it. As it happens, his isn't actually the only mission also going north. To start off with, they'll be sailing with another expedition which is more equipped with soldiers who are then instructed to engage with a group of the dead in battle, to kind of judge how fighting them will actually be, and they'll be aided in this with the help of an original character, the only original character I'm pretty sure I'm adding into this, who I have named Zana. She being the her mentioned before in regards to Haline's projects that he was told to move on from by Cersei previously. So Xana's whole deal is that she is a warg who had travelled further south from the north to try and avoid all of the fighting in that regard. However, in doing so, when people further south had witnessed her abilities and so forth, she had been captured and through inhospitable treatment and ultimately brought to the alchemists for study of the warg ability. Euron jokes that if this woman can really put her mind into any sort of animal, then why not at any point before now, because again she's now been in the alchemist's study ever since, why didn't she walk herself into a bird and drown herself or something like that? And it's kind of acknowledged that she tried just that, but that's when she just discovered that if the animal dies, any warg just reverts back to their true form. For context, if you don't remember from the show, you haven't seen the show, regarding wargs, as these people who can put their minds into animals and so forth, kind of like what Bran was doing, but Bran was taking it even further with the green sight. If the animal dies, they revert back into their human mind. If the human body is killed while they're warging, then that person becomes permanently trapped inside the animal. But anyway, that's kind of what's going to be happening with the North. They're going to be using her ability. She would say, go into a bird and fly overhead, identify for them kind of a suitable enough, small enough group of the undead that they can try to fight against. And again, they'll see how that goes. This separate to Euron's individual capturing of a white. In that northern part of the continent, though, at Pike, which is part of the Iron Islands, Yara receives Sansa's raven informing her of what's happening and requesting aid from the Iron Islands regarding their escape. Yara thus proceeds to kind of rally up the Ironborn to get in their ships and come to help as best they can. Over on kind of the opposite side of the continent, but more or less the same level, if I'm remembering the map correctly, Tyrion's group now arrive at White Harbour, where Lord Wyman Manderley kind of supports the sentiment of retreating south. So, since from the Battle of the Bastards, his was an opinion of you should avoid fighting and instead just try to keep the people safe so no one has to fall in battle. So is it agree? Yes. Flee southwards rather than trying to take on the White Walkers again. A sentiment he can approve of. There's little time actually spent in the town before they set sail south to get to the Vale, but when they are ready to move off, it's discussed how the islands are kind of in the middle, the Three Sisters, and those surrounding seas, they're not likely to be helpful. There's no point in, going to them for further assistance, as they're more of a haven for pirates and they don't treat outsiders well. They should just keep on sailing straight on until they reach the Vale. At which point, we then just reach the fight, again, per this original splitting up of these stories, but again, they'd probably be rearranged and shuffled in different ways in actuality. But in this version, the final scene of episode 4, once again, it's back up at Winterfell like the previous episode, where we now see that the weirwood tree in the Godswood has been uprooted and the White Walkers have now dug down far beneath it, even deeper than the crypts of Winterfell were. And what they've found is kind of something left behind by the children of the forest all those millennia ago. And so now the Night King stands in one of many caverns that have been uncovered as part of this, and we're seeing glimpses of other relics of an ancient time, but there's one in particular that's being focused upon, and this is one that appears to contain large, dormant cocoons. And with that, we now come to, in this arrangement, the finale of the new Series 8. Again, with however it would be split up into 5/6. And then the remainder of this idea being part 2 of the video, that becoming a new Series 9 afterwards. As it happens, as we'll see, the ending of this episode 5 does kind of work as a cliffhanger anyway. So it's kind of convenient how that happens and how, we can split it down the middle and it works that way. But anyway, as I was saying, episode 5, as I've listed it, titled The Game's Price. We open, in fact, not with any of the characters we've been following in the last few episodes, but rather at the Carhold, where those who either couldn't or wouldn't join the soldiers of House Karstark in the Battle of Winterfell now find themselves surrounded by the dead. and those ranks of wights are closing in all around them, forcing them deeper and deeper into the heart of their castle without there then being any way that they can get out. As these people are finally overcome, it's with the wight of Alice Karstark being at the forefront of that deadly tide. After that kind of dark opening, however, we then jump to Missandei and Grey Worm, who, as I say, the Unsullied have been slowly kind of breaking off to act to set off warnings, if needs be, of how far the dead are getting, and the pair of them, happen to have stopped at Moat Cailin. At the time that we're seeing the scene, this is where Daenerys is now returning on Drogon from Dragonstone with some more dragon glass, and while there, she's kind of just checking with them, where have the rest of them gone? Which way does she actually need to take Drogon to return to them with the dragon glass? Still, though, not leaving immediately, because the three of them have what conversation they may wish with how well they know each other, and Drogon just kind of doing his thing in the background around the castle. This would be where we would kind of see more of the fire and the wrathfulness that Daenerys has regarding the Iron Throne, the hints of her potentially becoming the Mad Queen, as her father was the Mad King. And there's kind of the suggestion that if she wanted to, she could just take Drogon right now, just forget the others, fly straight to King's Landing and kill Cersei then and there, if she wanted to. But then also, just kind of to balance this, you also, although still not entirely wholesome, it's still kind of, there's something off about Daenerys's viewpoint in this case. She then is also focusing on the fact that the love that Grey Worm and Missandei are sharing, this is the sort of thing that she's fighting to preserve once she's broken the wheel and has taken control of the Seven Kingdoms. Meanwhile, over in Braavos in Essos, the Iron Bank has been overcome by a group of red priests and priestesses, led by Kinvara, and they are now burning the likes of Tycho Nestorius and kind of the other bankers as sacrifices to the Lord of Light for fortune in what is about to come. And also because by destroying the Iron Bank in this way, essentially, they're looking to kind of negate all of the debt that the throne has previously accrued under the previous people who've sat upon it, so that when the next person who, presumably under the Red Priest and Priestess's preference, would end up on the throne, they wouldn't have to worry about that same, recurring monetary burden. On the horizon over the narrow sea, we can see even from this distance the cloud of winter still kind of spreading from right to left, from the north down south. And then, last, just one of their number there informs someone else that word of her presence has been sent to King's Landing. This cuts to Yakin's ship as they arrive in Dawn, and then he, still wearing Alaria's face, then kind of uses the apparent status that he has in this disguise to indeed successfully convince the military at Dawn to go north and join the forces that are amassing around King's Landing. As part of this, Elia and Obella, the second and third eldest of the remaining Sand Snakes, they go with them because they see this as an opportunity to take vengeance for their father against the mountain and the man Qyburn who brought him back to life, which they see as obviously a massive insult to the memory of their father. Meanwhile, the eldest of the Sand Snakes, Sorella Sand, she is still staying behind to continue ruling over Dawn. Over around the coast of the Westerlands, the Iron Fleet, as led by Yara, are now gathering resources from the settlements that they pass and kind of stockpiling ahead of when Sansa's group may be able to join them looking for sanctuary. As part of this, she and the Ironborn are also having to have the discussion of just how many people are they expecting to be helping and can they practically help. For Sansa's group itself, they by this point have made it to the Twins, where they find Edmure Tully having turned himself from prisoner into a lord after the demise of the men of House Frey. So he was too embarrassed with what happened to him to actually return to Riverrun, so he set himself up here instead. From here, they then send a raven to the Eyrie to update Tyrion and his group on their position and what's happened, everything in that regard. With the whole Exodus now seeming able to take a pause for a moment, the likes of Brienne Jaime, Tormund and other surviving soldiers set about trying to train as rudimentarily and quickly as possible all of the other people who they've managed to bring along with them who might be fit for battle, and some who maybe even aren't, because at this point they need everyone on hand they can get. It's very quickly clear, though, that these people aren't an army and aren't going to be one, no matter how much training they can manage to squeeze in. That being said, with the dragon glass that they have managed to get from Daenerys by this point so far, as again she keeps going backwards and forwards, they have in some cases actually managed to make dragon glass weapons again, courtesy of Gendry and others like him. Sometimes they may just take some bits of dragon glass and tie it to other things, like at the end of a stick to make a spear. And in other cases, some people don't really have a choice other than to just use like lumps of dragon glass and practice for close quarters combat with that, because better than nothing. Up at Moat Cailin again, the Unsullied, who had been even further north than that, who had split off before Grey Worm and Missandei, they have now caught up with them, having lit their pyres previously as well, because saying the dead are now getting that much closer to where that pair have situated themselves. Grey Worm assures them that when Daenerys comes by their way again, because she does keep on coming by Grey Worm and Missandei, because again, their personal relationships to each other, he assures them that she'll keep them safe and protect them and get them out of there with the help of Drogon. However, others among the Unsullied, while still adhering to Daenerys, are thinking that no, they should continue to retreat as was the original plan. This then is ultimately conceded to. Yes, they will set off indeed, and they make sure before they do to light a pyre at Moat Cailin as well. Also, at the very least, even though Daenerys isn't there right now, she had still previously left some bits of dragon glass with Grey Worm and Missandei, leaving them with something. Therefore, they do know that when they leave, even without Drogon to help protect them, they do have something which they can potentially use. And again, they'll, like what was being done down at the Twins, some of the dragon glass they can try to equip to things like spears and stuff and weapons, etc. Over towards the east, at the Eyrie, Robin Arryn is seen that, upon finding himself ruling over a region that's about to come under attack from winter, he's sent out his other soldiers to try to hold it off. However they're supposed to do that. And it's also known that there are some other settlements out there in the Vale in general where they either don't know what's coming or they are trying to protect against it, but still it's not like they have much on their side that they could use to do so. Soon after their arrival there, therefore, Tyrion and Davos set about trying to advise Robin in how better to strategize and be tactical in these regards. Meanwhile, Jon Voice goes off to try to find some people that he knows from the military forces of the Vale that have indeed been sent off to try to defend against the dead when they eventually arrive. As Sam and Gilly settle into the Eyrie, they then actually end up being approached by some red priests and priestesses, and they specify that they've come ahead of those who are still in Braavos. This is like an advance guard. And they say that Sam and Gilly need to come with them further south still towards the Isle of Faces. Kinvara, meanwhile, while she was in the Braavos scene, she has also made sure to be among the first to then quickly go over to Westeros. She, meanwhile, is addressing Melisandre herself, and it kind of implies to her that, her purpose is to be somewhere further to the west again, rather than on the east coast, here in the Eyrie. Of course, once again, if Melisandre is going to be going off somewhere, she's going to be making sure that Arya goes with her, and where Arya goes, Ghost goes as well. Since these kind of two factions both are planning to leave the Eyrie, for the time being at least, you then still have them travelling together. So again, Sam, Gilly, Melisandre, Arya, Ghost, and the Red Priests and Priestesses heading off, and eventually they'll separate to go their separate ways, but for now they'll depart together, leaving it as just as Tyrion, Davos, and Jon as being the arrivers who are staying around this fortress. In regards to Daenerys, as she once again is just about to approach Dragonstone on Drogon, she suddenly finds that Cersei's forces have now, in the interim, since last she were there, occupied the island and have set up their kind of scorpion ballistas, which are now able to fire in Drogon's direction. And so this is part of kind of how Euron's group were going via Dragonstone previously. They've left some people behind there as well, because of local reports that alerted them to the fact that Daenerys was coming backwards and forwards from there. So they're waiting in ambush for her, as well as being able to harvest some dragonstones themselves, because again they've learnt from the scrolls and whatever, and all the news that came from the north that dragonstone is the weapon to use against the dead. Anyway, that's there. And since Daenerys can no longer land on the island to gather dragonglass that way, it instead occurs to her that maybe, although it'll be a much longer trip, they can try to go now to the ruins of Valeria to try to pick up anything from there. As such, they set off over the narrow sea towards Essos. At the Twins, with night having now fallen, those who are on watch are incapacitated, which we then see to be at the hands of a White Walker, and then this allows for a group of Whites to then enter the eastern side of the castle, moving steadily through the shadows, kind of at least until they're seen, at which point they burst out and kind of attack people. This kind of small group of Whites all consists of the reanimated forms of familiar faces, those being Jorah, Beric, Theon, Lyanna Mormont, and having been brought from all the way on the opposite side of the wall, Hodor. When it comes to then people inside the Twins having to deal with this sudden insurgency of Whites, when it's in the case of people who recognise the undead, that, prompts hesitation, and while they know they have to defend themselves, they don't want to attack or harm or kill these Whites, and therefore either it means they have to run away, or they have to push through it, or it relies on another person who doesn't know that White as well, swinging in and saving them in that moment. This is what the titular game's price is primarily referring to. The fact that all of these people have been lost in the larger pursuit for control of the Seven Kingdoms. Once all of those Whites have been dispatched with, we then kind of pan away to see at a distance the White Walker form of Jon Snow, having watched the proceedings. Now that it's done, you can turn away and return back over the hills, and it's just left to see how this kind of gamble in order to destabilise the group has worked. And again, to clarify, this is what he was searching for when he was walking through the ranks of Whites previously. He was searching for the Whites of people he knew would cause emotional resonance in the Exodus group. Further, slightly more inland and south, by this point, those that had left the Eyrie have already kind of gone their separate ways. And so we've got Sam and Gilly and some of the Red Priests and Priestesses. They've arrived at the Isle of Faces at this point, with Gilly's visions having aided them in navigating the mists of the surrounding waters of the God's Eye that usually prevents people from finding the island itself. And so the group get off the boat and onto the island, and they find the remains of the last of the Green Men, who, unbeknownst to everyone else in the outside world, have actually kind of died out in the years previous, after which the tending to the weirwood trees there has kind of gone unchecked. Amongst what the Green Men left behind was another boat on the shore. That means they have another way of getting backwards and forwards to the mainland. On reaching the centre of the island, Gilly suggests that they should use what's left of the Green Men's tools to thus dig beneath the biggest of the remaining weirwood trees. Up further north, Grey Worm's group, which has accrued more unsullied since we last saw them, as again they keep on going south, they now, as winter's cloud still keeps on kind of bearing down upon them, they notice that there's actually already a small faction of the undead visible in the distance heading towards another settlement, kind of like, imagine, further to their right across the landscape. So feeling like they should intervene, the Unsullied kind of veer off the road and go to kind of position themselves kind of on either side of the group of Whites in secret, at which point, crouching behind the shallow hills, they get a clear sight of the White Walker that's controlling these group of undead, who's in turn riding upon their own undead horse. When the moment is right, one of the Unsullied launches a spear that, as I say, has been tipped with dragonglass towards the White Walker, only for it to be caught by that rider. Of course, that was the plan that got it distracted, because while it was focusing on then, that spear, the others then throw their other weapons from other angles, and the White Walker only has so many hands, and eventually one of them manages to pierce it and cause it to shatter, thus all of the surrounding dead in that group collapse as well. In this victory, the Unsullied thus go to the settlement that was about to be attacked to again warn them of what they were just saved from and about what's still to come. However, these residents, they didn't actually see the dead, and they haven't seen what's coming. I mean, they can see the cloud, but that's just clouds. They don't believe that there's any danger, And so ultimately, despite the fact that Missandei doesn't like this fact, the others agree that, well, these people, it's their right to choose. And the Unsullied still need to protect themselves, and so they carry on moving south again, leaving the settlement behind. Over the narrow sea, a weary Daenerys is actually greeted by the remainder of the Red Priests and Priestesses in their boats. So they, rather than just coming straight over from Braavos, they've kind of come slightly further south to meet her, which they clearly knew was going to happen, because as well as their boats, they've also constructed and have between the ships this kind of large raft-like platform that Drogon is able to land on and rest for a while before he then takes off and carries on the rest of the way towards Valyria, kind of off-screen. So they come across the ships in the raft and they land and they have their conversation in the meantime. At the Twins, as Sansa's group recover from what just happened regarding the White attack the previous night, so they're wondering, how it is that a small group managed to get so far. Was it just they happened to splinter off from the main body of the dead and get this far on a fluke? Or, is it actually a sign that the rest of the dead are already so far south? Given that they were all familiar faces who attacked, it would lead them to correctly conclude that there must be something more specific afoot. It's noticed in the distance, just visible on the horizon, that one of the Unsullied's pyres has now been lit, and so they know the dead are at least somewhere around there. This all being said, Sansa still wants them to remain in the Twins for a little while longer, again, despite the fact that it's been breached, because even though for that, it still is a defence. It is a fortress. They can try to stay safe in here, rather than if they carry on now, they might instead be caught out in the open. Not everyone is going to stay as such. Varys, by this point, has decided that he's of more use at King's Landing, trying to rebuild his spy network once again, for when the rest of the group do end up back down there and are trying to take on Cersei. Because otherwise, he reveals that he's been lying to the small council about what Daenerys had been instructing him with. He's not doing what he was supposed to. He's been feeling guilty about that already. So just let me go on and be where I'm going to be more useful. When he learns that Varys is going to be going to King's Landing, the Hound also chooses to split off from the main group. Arya has already gone anyway, and also the Hound wants to make sure that he ultimately gets his fight with his brother, the Mountain. He wants to make sure that they get to face off again at least once more, rather than, say, falling to the dead too early, still too far north. So thus, Varys and the Hound split off, and everyone else is staying in that castle for at least a little while longer. Back with Grey Worm's group, their route, which again had already gone off the road to help with that settlement or whatever, and as has happened, as has transpired since, rather than properly returning back to the road again, they've now ended up kind of in the swamps of the Neck. Here, rather than them being come upon by the undead, they're instead attacked by a lizard lion, another creature from the books, which kind of emerges from the water to attack them. The Unsullied, because of how many there are able to kill it. However, Missandei is injured in the process. Not fatally, but they need to get her some sort of aid. It's fortunate, therefore, at this point, that some of the Crannog men who live in these swamps around the Neck make themselves known and guide them to Greywater Watch. Up at Ramsgate, Euron's ship has finally arrived in the north, and so he and his small group of soldiers are kind of bracing themselves to try to capture a White for Cersei, but this is not before the larger lot of soldiers then, with Zana's kind of advice with her based on her warging, they set off on their own to intercept their own relatively small faction of Whites that have kind of been left behind, kind of just wandering about the countryside, while the rest of the main army of the dead have carried on towards the south. The scene focuses on Euron's group because he's the named known character, and so they end up exploring a decimated castle, and they indeed come across their own, just a very small number of lingering Whites, or quite possibly just people who were killed in the castle, and then while they were brought back to life, it wasn't as part of the main horde. Anyway, as part of this, there's kind of a suspenseful sequence, but as they kind of go around trying to get it, wondering where it is, etc., but they do manage to capture it, and they do manage to bring one back to their ship, this to Euron's boastful cheers. As they do so, they meet up with the remaining few surviving soldiers who had gone on to fight off the larger, small group of the undead who were there before, who say that even though their losses were great, they were nevertheless able to come out on top in the end, at least again in that contained scenario. Just to pour salt into the wound, however, in a moment of confusion aboard the ship, the wight that Euron had managed to capture kind of lurches forwards and manages to bite one of those surviving soldiers before it's able to be wrangled back under control. This thing is still very much a wild animal, for all that Euron may have captured it. Over down at the Eyrie, 2 ravens arrive at this point. The first being another one from the twins, now informing them of the White attack, updating them in that regard as well, and also acknowledging that indeed those characters have since noticed that White Walker Jon is also seen in that territory, so they know that he's there at the very least. Still holding out hope for Jon, again this is the acknowledgement that he's still around, Tyrion thinks that if anyone is going to be able to find something that can save him, it will be with the likes of like Sam, because he seemed to be the one knowledgeable about the White Walkers before, and also maybe the Red Priests and Priestesses. Tyrion indeed then sets off south to follow those who are going towards the God's Eye previously, and kind of as he goes, he also takes with him Donal Waynwood and Maud. Maud being his kind of prison guard all the way back in season 1, who since then, with the gold that Tyrion left him with at that time, he's managed to make a slightly better life for himself. So either way, they go on the fastest horses that way. Meanwhile, the second raven is actually there to inform the Eyrie of the fall of the 3 sisters to winged winter. Finally then, on kind of this closing scene for this series, we then return to the Isle of Faces, to where Tyrion is now headed, and it's seen that that digging underneath the largest weirwood tree has indeed finally yielded results. With a deep, deep underground, they have found their own secret chamber left by the children of the forest, like what the Night King previously found up in Winterfell, although this one has more of a light about it, whereas that one was all frosty and dark and again ominous with the cocoons. There's nothing as obvious in this underground chamber comparatively that's like, okay, this is going to be what's got out of it, but still, as I say, the whole atmosphere is slightly more hopeful that they've found something which might at last be of help. And then before those closing moments on the God's Eye, you could also just have the Red Priest and Priestesses clarifying for any other characters who don't know what they are, who the children of the forest were. With that, we kind of close out on this new version of Series 8. So, what do we think then is going to happen in Series 9? 6 more episodes, delivered as 5, and we'd redistribute them in some way. What still is there left to happen? We have, I say just to wrap up and clarify, the majority of your people from the north who have survived now holding out in the twins. You've got your White Walker Jon Snow kind of in that area as well, clearly potentially scheming something else. The Night King has found some kind of dormant cocoons and other relics of the past underneath the ruins of Winterfell. You've potentially got your Ironborn ships on the west who are preparing as best they can to help Sansa's group if they do cross paths. You've got Tyrion kind of now more on his own between the Eyrie and, well, again, you've got Donal and Maud with him, but, between the Eyrie and the God's Eye. With that, the Eyrie itself, you've got, Davos and Jon with Robin and then any of the other remaining soldiers of the Vale. Down at the God's Eye itself, just to restate what we've just said, you've got your Sam and Gilly and the Red Priests and Priestesses there who have just discovered this chamber. Melisandre, Arya, Ghost and Kinvara are kind of more crossing the midway point of the continent going west, somewhere that's still unspecified. Grey Worm, Missandei and the other Unsullied have just been taken in by the Crannog men towards Greywater Watch, with Missandei still being injured. Further south, we have Cersei now preparing King's Landing with the Golden Company and knowledge from Old Town and all that to fend off whatever comes from the north, with indeed Jaqen wearing Illyria's face, still now bringing the soldiers of Dawn further up north, including 2 of the Sand Snakes who want to get revenge on Qyburn and the Mountain. Other renovations seemingly are still happening at the Red Keep, may or may not be connected to whatever task Cersei reassigned Qyburn to, which we still don't really know about. We know that Anguy is also still around King's Landing, one of the last remaining named members of the Brotherhood Without Banners, after which, just thinking about the Narrow Sea, up north, you've got Euron's forces now travelling back south, where they captured White for some scheme of Cersei's. Meanwhile, Daenerys has just been meeting with the Red Priests and Priestesses on her way towards Valyria to try to obtain some more dragonglass, now that Dragonstone has become occupied by Cersei's forces. And lastly, we have Quaithe, who still we don't know quite what she was about, but she was still seen over in Essos before as part of some sort of dealing for what's being prepared for events to come. The Night King needs to be slain, Cersei needs to be defeated. Well, how is that all going to transpire? If you have any ideas based on what I've set up, leave them in the comments below, or you can mention any of the other social medias that are linked in the description. You know, this is kind of your opportunity to, what is your sequel to my sequel with the threads that I have set up? How would you continue it? We'll find out in another 4 weeks in the part 2 to this, where we go through the remainder of my, what was again, I'll still stand was a sequel at the time rather than retroactive alternate version of Game of Thrones, final season, bracket S. That one I'm feeling might actually be even longer than this, because while there was the added section at the fore end, where I gave context to the Game of Thrones stuff, still the first couple of episodes didn't need to add that much, whereas these will now be 5 fully fledged episodes like 4 and 5 were here. I'm only adding more time to this episode by saying this. You can now check back on other videos on this channel. If you want, you can hang around to watch both, again, part 2 to this in a month's time, or the other videos that come out in between, which will be, as per usual, back to the regular Ragnarok Chronicles own book, lore, topic, videos, things. There is an announcement actually coming out on Saturday that I really advise that you keep an eye out for. And in the meantime, regardless of what you do, the main thing is just remember to keep on telling stories.